Part 30. The Cubicle Canvas. Chapter 1. The Geometry of Enclosure. If the wide valley was a roar and the neon mirage was a dream, the administrative core was a silence, so absolute it felt like a physical weight. Here, the grand architecture of the city transitioned from the soaring heights of glass towers to the suffocating intimacy of the interior. Alara found herself standing within the threshold of her assigned workspace, a space small, defined by angled walls that seemed to press inward with every passing second. This was the cubicle canvas, a sudden limit placed upon the soul. It was a three-sided box of gray fabric and recycled plastic, a modular cell designed to minimize distraction and maximize the output of the human resource. To look at the floor was to see a grid within a grid, 1,000 identical boxes stretching into the dim fluorescent distance. Each one was a cage for a consciousness, a tiny theater where the drama of a life was reduced to the clicking of keys and the soft whirring of a cooling fan. Inside these walls, the inner turmoil, sorrow, and the grief of a million individual lives were concealed completely behind empty masks. To show emotion was to be inefficient. To express grief was to be a friction point in the corporate flow. Ilara sat at her desk, her face settling into the practiced neutrality required by the environment. She was a mask among masks, a ghost in a gray box. She felt the heavy thrum of her own heart, but here, even that felt like an intrusion, a messy biological rhythm that had no place in the world of the angled walls. The geometry was not just physical, it was psychological. The angles of the cubicle were designed to focus the eyes forward, toward the glowing screen that served as the only window to the world. Anything outside that 90-degree field of vision was irrelevant. The past, the sky, the faces of others, all were edited out by the gray fabric. This was the final refinement of the grid, the enclosure of the mind. Chapter 2. The Loop of Simple Tasks. As the workday officially commenced, the audio systems within the core activated. It was not the pounding rhythm of the valley or the hazy nostalgia of the mirage. Instead, a synth loop started a sequence, plain and brief. It was a minimalist pulse, a simple rhythm meant for simple tasks. It was the sound of a clock ticking in a digital vacuum, a metronome for the soul that demanded a steady, unthinking pace. This was the geometry of hurry and of greed, disguised as professional order. The loop provided a structure for the day, a sequence of 4 notes that repeated every 4 seconds, hour after hour. It was designed to keep the brain in a state of low-level engagement, just enough to process data, but not enough to think. Alara's fingers began to move across the keyboard, matching the cadence of the loop. She was no longer Ilara. She was an extension of the sequence. In this space, the sacrifice of purpose to the game was complete. The game was the maintenance of the city's vast, incomprehensible bureaucracy, the moving of numbers from one column to another, the filing of reports that no one would read, the digital grooming of the machine. The loop made it bearable. It acted as a rhythmic anesthetic, numbing the part of her that asked why. As long as the loop continued, there was a sense of progress, even if the progress was circular. She watched the cursor blink on her screen. Blink, blink, blink. It was perfectly synchronized with the synth loop. She felt herself slipping into the trance of the sequence, her identity dissolving into the gray fabric of the walls. The sorrow and the grief she had felt on the bridge, the sudden revelation of the stars, all of it felt like a dream from another life. Here, there was only the sequence. There was only the task. Chapter 3. The Gray Schedule. Before her sat the workstation, a digital canvas that waited for her input, but this canvas held no color. It only held the gray. It was a canvas of spreadsheets, of logistical charts, and of the heavy schedule of the passing clock. The clock was the true master of the core. It didn't just track time. It consumed it. Every minute was accounted for. Every second was a resource to be spent in the service of the grid. Ilara tried to find a solace in the beat. She leaned into the simplicity of the loop, attempting to turn it into a mantra. If she could just stay within the rhythm, perhaps she wouldn't have to feel the void of the empty day. She focused on the mechanical beauty of the numbers, trying to ignore every single sudden shock of memory, the smell of rain, the warmth of a hand, the sound of a real voice. But the shocks came anyway. A flicker of the overhead light would remind her of lightning. The way a coworker sighed would remind her of the wind. Each time a memory broke through, she felt the sudden limit of the walls more acutely. The solace was a lie. The beat was not a companion. It was a cage. The canvas of her life was being filled with the gray ink of the schedule, leaving no room for the vivid colors of the neon mirage or the raw energy of the valley. The clock ticked forward, a relentless, mechanical judge. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. The day was a sequence of disappearing increments. She was trading her life for the gray, minute by minute, in a transaction that left her poorer with every passing hour. The geometry of greed was not about money. It was about the theft of time. The city required her hours to keep its lights burning, and in return it gave her a small, angled space and a 4-note loop. Chapter 4. The Sound of Decay. As the afternoon wore on, the nature of the audio changed. The synth loop didn't stop, but it began to fade, slow and low. It became a sound of endless, quiet, slow decay. The notes seemed to stretch, losing their sharp edges, becoming a mournful, atmospheric drone that echoed the exhaustion of the workers within the grid. It was the sound of a battery running out, of a world that was slowly, quietly dying from the inside out. Elara felt the decay in her own spirit. The final loss of all she used to know was happening right here, in the silence of the cubicle. The memories of the world outside, the broken past she had once mourned, were becoming thin and transparent, like old film left in the sun. She could no longer remember the specific shade of a summer sky or the feeling of grass beneath her feet. Those things didn't exist in the geometry of the core. The heavy sorrow of the empty day settled over her like a shroud. This was the true cost of the impersonal grid. It wasn't the noise or the lights. It was the emptiness. It was the realization that she had become a mask, that the inner turmoil had been suppressed for so long that it had turned into a cold, hollow space. The loop continued its slow fade, a digital ghost of a rhythm marking the end of a day that had never truly begun. She looked at the canvas on her screen, the completed charts, the processed data. It was a monument to nothing. She had spent 10 hours within the angled walls, and the world was exactly as it had been when she arrived. The city had eaten another day of her life, and in exchange it had given her the strength to come back tomorrow and do it again. Chapter 5. The Mask in the Canvas. The workday ended not with a bang, but with the soft click of the workstation powering down. The lights in the core dimmed to a rust mode glow, a pale, sickly light that made the gray walls look like tombstone slate. Elara stood up, her joints stiff, her mind a clouded mirror of the synth loop's decay. She adjusted her mask, the professional, neutral expression she wore to navigate the corridors, and stepped out of her cell. She walked past 1,000 other empty masks, all moving toward the exits in a slow, funeral procession. No one spoke. The sorrow was collective, but it was also profoundly private. They were a legion of the lonely, bound together by the same geometry and the same schedule, yet separated by the very walls they were forced to build around themselves. As she reached the transit hub, she looked back at the administrative core. It was a massive, lightless block, a fortress of the impersonal. Inside, the cubicle canvases were empty, waiting for the morning when the loop would start again and the gray schedule would resume its march. Elara felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief, not for the past, but for the present. She grieved for the girl who had disappeared behind the angled walls. She grieved for the purpose that had been sacrificed to the gain. But as she stepped onto the train, the doors hissing shut behind her, she realized that the mask was still there. She was still standing. The loop had faded, but her own heart was still beating, a stubborn, syncopated rhythm that the city had not yet managed to colonize. The day was empty, the sorrow was heavy, but the canvas of her soul, hidden deep beneath the gray, was still waiting for it, a different kind of light. The absolute silence holds a physical weight. Within the angled walls of gray and plastic, 1,000 boxes stretch in lines of straight, where souls are bound in motions quite monastic. A 4-note pulse begins its simple loop, to numb the mind and keep the fingers moving, while weary workers in their circles stoop. The cold efficiency of greed improving. The clock consumes the hours one by one, a digital master in a vacuum, ticking until the vivid colors of the sun are lost to keys and cooling fans, a clicking. The workstation powers down with one soft sound as hollow masts retreat in slow procession, though heavy sorrow wraps the core around. A stubborn heart survives this long oppression.